We were just discussing, I asked how long she's been on Blueprints, and she said we came together, so we're litter mates.
Did I come a year? Where's Dale?
It's been like
It's-
about
Is it, I think it's 2 years from
2 years.
2 years,
2 years,
about 2
yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And she says here, is a professor at Vanderbilt University and is the developer of the Strong African American Families Project and the PAAS, which is, what's that, PAAS?
Pathways for African American
For African
Success.
American. Which are, I'm guessing you'll talk about.
Yes.
And is really interested in this question about how do we maintain program fidelity so that we know that it works, but be responsive to communities at the same time and develop this partnership between the two. You're also president-elect of the Society for Research on Adolescence.
I am.
So thank you for taking time out
Yes.
to come talk
I'm
to us.
elect, so
So,
Crosno is doing the work right now.
yeah. So with that, why don't I just let you take over?
Okay, that sounds good. And I am, wasting soda.
There goes your caffeine.
There goes my caffeine, so I'll just drink water. Do I need to, I don't have to leave this right here, right? Because I want to move it so that I'm not in the front of the.
And do you want a remote control?
Well, I've got this laptop where it has to have its own adapter.
I see.
And I have the
Whoops.
adapter. Whoops. There you go. I had the adapter, but I didn't want to change the whole setup, which is exactly what I just did.
No, it'll,
Be careful what you do when you are
it should come
working
back.
with technology.
Oh, it's changing colors.
And there it is. Okay, so I won't bother that again. Okay. Well, I am very delighted to be here today, and I said to Pamela earlier, or maybe Beverly, I don't know, that I have some things that I'm going to share with you, but I always view settings where I'm going to learn something too. So this should be a reciprocal process. I want to learn from you, and the way that I will learn is that you're going to ask me questions or you'll comment. And Dick has already told me he has a very hard question for me before he even knows what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll start with giving you a brief overview of what I'm going to focus on today. And so I'll start with sharing with the audience what you already know, and that is we're in the midst of a diversity explosion. And I want us to take that information in the context of thinking about the implications of that for preventive interventions and for the work that we do. Because the population shift is happening, and in fact next year it would have happened. So we need to think about that in the context of this, as well as what do we mean when we talk about cultural adaptation and cultural tailoring in the context of that. And then I'll give a brief overview of why it's really important to think about healthy adolescent development or healthy development by sharing a brief overview of the recent statistics from CDC on risk engagement behaviors. And then I'll delve a bit more into looking at this notion of what is culture and what is cultural adaptation? Why do we do it? Is it effective? For whom, when, how? And what you'll end up knowing at the end of my presentation is a slide to tell you where we are with regard to that. So you'll have to stay for the whole talk. And so I'll start with giving you a brief overview of where we are in terms of our diversity explosion. And it shows here what is going to happen by 2045, but what is going to happen for the young people by 2020. Many of us focus on adolescent development or early childhood development, with very few of us focusing on people that are, as my father said, beyond middle age. So what does that say then about the work that we do and how we need to think about preventive interventions? So I bring this to your attention along with the next slide that shows you really what we talk about when we talk about diversity, oftentimes in these categories. But again, you can see what the shift is looking like from even 2016 to what's being projected in 2060. So all of this has implications for why people are spending a lot of time understanding this notion of cultural tailoring and cultural adaptation. It's really being driven by the populations for whom we're doing a lot of our work with and the communities that we're working with. But I bring this picture up here as well because it's important when we think about diversity is that we also give attention to multiple diversities. So we have LGBTQIA individuals that are from different ethnic, racial groupings, from different social class, from different research regions in the U.S. and in different communities. So diversity is much bigger than the way that we oftentimes talk about it, and so is culture. So why is this important? And it is important because we need to know the best strategies that we can engage in to reduce these behaviors from occurring. And the question is, can universal programs that we already have on the shelf that are listed in blueprints that may have been tested on non-Caucasian, Midwestern, middle-class kids, or is it that we need to really look at what is culture and then begin to talk about culture in the context of addressing all of these issues that our young people are telling us over the past 30 days before the survey, this is what they were doing. So it's important. It's important for those reasons, if nothing else, and even more important is to determine whether or not culturally adapting and culturally tailoring programs will result in reducing and preventing a lot of these behaviors that are noted here. So what's the implication for this? Well, preventive interventions, according to Resco and his colleagues, preventive interventions must be responsive to the cultural practices and worldview of subgroups for whom the interventions are intended. That's the premise that guides all of our efforts to understand this question that we've been grappling with for quite a while. So they're telling us it's important to do that in order to be able to do the things that I just said earlier in terms of preventing these behaviors. And I said to Dave as we were coming from the airport a few minutes ago that this topic, Pamela, I appreciate your suggesting it because though I've written about this, it gave me an opportunity to really critically look at this from the perspective of whether or not it is the thing to do, and if so, how, why, and for whom, and for how much of the program. So, but continued arguments continue to center around whether adaptations, can they be responsive to the varying culture? Is it possible to do that? And is it necessary, and is it feasible to do that? Okay, so those were the questions that I thought about as I went through this. So we know a lot of things. So the present issues that we're confronted with are those. While preventive intervention programs have been shown to be effective and ready for large-scale implementation, the majority of them have been tested on Caucasian populations. That's what's driving the presenting need for people to ask the question, is cultural adaptation necessary? There's a lack of sufficient evidence that many of the existing programs are effective for preventing or reducing behavioral disorders in non-Caucasian youth. So again, that has led us to say, then the presenting issue is culturally tailoring and cultural adaptation necessary? Do evidence-based programs need to be adapted and tailored to be effective for implementation in diverse populations? And then other questions are, what does it mean when we say this? How do we know it matters? What are the evidence to demonstrate that it does matter when we do this? How much can occur before we begin to compromise the program such that it looks like something that the developer had no idea that this is what that program looked like? A total retailoring, or changing the program to something else. Is that what you want to do? Make a few modifications, or is it so necessary to change the program that when I see a program implemented in Colorado for African American families, and it's a strong African American families program, has the adaptation occurred such that I don't recognize that program? So, and if that is the extent of the structuring, is it working much better than what we did many years ago when we launched this program? Adaptations may transcend, and that's why it's important. It may transcend ethnicity and race to address an issue because the adaptation may be driven by SES, or geographic context, where people live, rather than just looking at what we're calling culture. So let's talk about culture. So culture actually is people's way of living, it's their language, it's the rituals that they have, it's the religious connection that they have, it's the norms that govern how people do what they do. But guess what we do when we talk about culturally tailoring programs, except for those programs that target Latino populations or Latinx populations. Much of it is based on these artificially, socially prescribed, phenotypic characteristic grouping of people. So when you look at culturally tailoring, they're really programs tailored for subpopulations of people that look like each other. So that's the first thing I want you to think about. So focusing on race as a way of saying your program needs to be culturally tailored assumes that all the people in this subgroup have the same culture. That's what we're assuming. So I have more questions than I do answers, but that's why we have a lot of time to talk about all this stuff. So when we say cultural adaptation and cultural tailoring, if you begin to really read those articles, including the ones that Brody and I did, how did we really do the adaptation that's culturally relevant, culturally appropriate, culturally tailoring, okay? But all these things have a lot to do with heterogeneity within these populations, and have we really addressed them? So the schools of thought that says, yes, we need to culturally tailor and culturally adapt because the majority, as I said earlier, have been validated on groups very different than the groups for which these racial groups represent. Yes, because if we don't, then we perpetuate values and beliefs and norms that the dominant society way of doing things is the right way of doing things. We also run the risk that the risk and protective processes that we've included in this dominant program that was originally tested on Caucasian, we may run the risk that we're missing out on those risk and protective processes that's unique to those populations. And if we don't do that, then we miss an opportunity to maybe move things in a way that we can see the evidence of the program affecting because we've taken into consideration, for example, that some populations are exposed to racial or ethnic discrimination more than others. And then the notion is, yes, because they have actually demonstrated poor efficacy when you apply them to these populations that are non-Caucasian. Because many of the programs, according to Castro, actually are mismatched in terms of the values that these subpopulations have versus the values that are conveyed in those those Caucasian-focused validated programs. And so if you want the programs adopted by communities that represent those subpopulations, some researchers would say, of course you need to adapt them. Of course you need to tailor them. Because not only is it fitting the ecological niche of these communities, but it also increases the likelihood of buy-in. And the buy-in increases the likelihood then that they're going to keep your program and you don't have to keep it on the shelf hoping that someone would adopt it. So all of these things, this person says, when organizations are looking at programs for scaling up, they are interested in cultural adaptation if they're focusing on a particular population, because they'll get the families engaged, they can recruit them or individuals, and it's a much more effective program for them to have because they can see themselves in it. Then there is the no position. The no position is no, we shouldn't do this, and we shouldn't do this because developers have spent years designing, developing, engaging in efficacy trials, even doing effectiveness trials, and they know what works. So no, this is research, evidence, theory-based programs. And so no, they shouldn't be changed. Because if you do, and you don't do things the way that the program was designed to be delivered, then you'll end up not getting the results that you should get, and it is because you didn't stay true to the fidelity of the program. So there's an imbalance of fidelity to fit. Then the person said decisions can be made only if they're data-driven and you have identified and you have a justification for making alterations. People that take that position suggest then you have to first deliver the original program before you know that it doesn't work. Don't assume it's not going to work just because it was tested on middle-class Caucasian families. Do it first and then decide, and then there may not be a reason to make any changes or minor changes rather than an all-out tailoring or varying levels of adaptation. But if changes are needed, one school of thought is engage your community stakeholders first and let them take a look at it, and then do the pilot testing of it, and then they'll tell you what needs to be changed. But don't just assume straight out that a program needs to be changed. Okay. So when you do change, Benel and several other colleagues develop models for how to think about variability and how people go about making these changes. So the traditional approach is do things just as they are, and what you may do is have a few pictures of multiracial looking people in there, but don't make a lot of changes. The deep dive structure would be making relevant changes to the curriculum where you can see that the content and the process have been really shifted from this traditional surface looking. And these programs, they suggest, may be substantially different from the original program because the activities may differ, the content may be the same, but the way that the content is conveyed in these programs may be different. And so what the suggestion is, make sure you as the developer know what those core elements are that are key ingredients, nuggets, that have to be upheld if you're going to make those adaptations, and you need to share that with the person that wants to adapt and adopt your program. So some examples of surface versus deep structural changes. These are things that we oftentimes see when people say that they've culturally adapted a program. They have transferred the materials to a particular language. they have hired members that look like those individuals. And that's how they have made those changes. The activities are the same. The logic model of doing what you do is the same. The only thing that differs, I have hired people that look like and trained that look like the population, and I've translated into Spanish. And if they're not Spanish-speaking people, you may just only hire people that look like people. Deep dive would say, I want to look at the core values, beliefs, and norms and other significant aspects of this population. I want to take that information and their lifestyles, and I want to look at the curriculum with those lenses and make the decision about the extent to which the content and the process map onto these kinds of culturally relevant processes. Or it may involve understanding and working effectively with cultural nuances, which is something that, rest his soul, Tom DeShawn did with Family Checkup. They began to look at cultural nuances in order for them to begin to look at how do you integrate that in the way that we train and deliver this program. Looking then and requiring that if you have individuals delivering the program, which is something else that they did with Family Checkup, that you begin to train them to be culturally competent, such that if you do have staff that don't look like the population, they're still able to work effectively with them because they understand the values, the language, and they can convey with a sense of comfort talking with the target population. So then there are individuals that say, well, I want to culturally tailor the content, and I may do some changes to modifying the delivery process. For those individuals, it may be necessary if a group needs or wants certain kinds of programming not offered in the original program. And I'll share a side story with you now. We're in the process of writing a grant, we hope it gets funded, to test the Pathways for African American Success program in Chicago in highly violent crime communities to see whether or not the things that we targeted in that program are effective in dissuading kids from getting involved in violent behavior. Okay, so what we realized as we began to do pilot work in Nashville and Chicago, many of these families have already experienced trauma. So just think about, for those of you that know the Strong African American Families program, it really assumes that parents are in a place where they're ready to parent their kids. So I'm going to focus on how you can become an effective parent. Well, what if parents have to be prepared first themselves because of what they're dealing with before they're ready for this program? So what we're looking at, how do we then begin to integrate in this program trauma-informed self-care, management, practices, health, well-being, promotion for mothers as a supplement to this program because they're raising their children in highly violent communities. So that means then that they have already told us in the pilot study, and it would be very not mindful of us if we said, but this is how the program is delivered and this is what we're going to do. You're not meeting their needs. So there are going to be some changes to the way that we're delivering this program by embedding and infusing in that program activities that help these mothers begin to think about their self-care before they can begin to care for their kids. New content may be incorporated throughout the curriculum, which is what we know that we will probably have to do because of what they're asking for this particular program. Program process. The program may be presented but delivered with changes in the way that the information is delivered. So some of them may be health educator driven program implementers. We may decide, which is actually what we do for all of our programs, community people are trained to deliver the program. So it may be as you're talking to your population, based on what the modification people will say, they don't want nurses, social workers, college students coming into the community delivering the program. They want to hire people from their own community. Or it may mean a different platform, such that group-based settings may not be an appropriate space if you're targeting grandmothers who are raising their grandchildren, which is what we found in the Pathways for African American Success. The grandmothers changed greater when they were assigned to receive the program via technology versus small groups. Why? We're not quite sure. What do we think? It's because in the small groups, you know, they ask you questions. You have to talk about, you have to air your stuff. And some of these parents may not want to talk about the circumstances that required them to be raising their own grandchildren. So the platform may differ, and this is something now that we know. The platform may differ in terms of what's the best method for receiving this program. So the manualized group-based method may not necessarily be the method that you have to always use, because it may not be what the neighbors want or the individuals want. So the delivering settings may differ. Rather than coming to this beautiful campus Boulder, they may say, I want to be in our own churches and I want our Sunday school teachers delivering this program if you want me to deliver it. And they're not college trained and they don't know research methods, but they do know our community. And so we have to think about this in the process of the modification. Some of the modifications in terms of deep dive may focus on cognitive information, such that you begin to look at not only changing the language, but the developmental levels for which the program may not have been originally designed to be delivered. If people can't understand the content, just say that your program is only on a 7th grade level and that everybody should understand it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they understand what's really happening. And so therefore, it may be necessary to use another method of conveying this information to the family so you know that what they know, and incorporating environmental issues relevant to the context. Motivational techniques are also important, and they may change as a function of all of these indicators that are noted here. So then I began to, after looking at what are people doing, first, what are people calling it? How are they making the decision? What are they actually doing in the method of changing programs or adapting or tailoring? Then the question that I asked was, what do the evidence show us in terms of, do they matter? As we're talking about this whole fidelity phenomenon in the context of adaptation. So my colleague at University of Arizona State said, most culturally specific or generic programs are equally effective for these 3 racial groups, is what this person said. And I have some studies to show you. So hold on to your seat. When differences were observed, they were associated with social class variability. We talked about all those indicators of diversity. It's not just phenotypic characteristic. Social class, but not due to racial, ethnic background. This broke my heart because I think it's important. I'm one of those people say yes. Okay, but you have to go with the evidence. We're researchers, we're scientists. A criticism of many of these studies, though, this person said, is that ethnic minority groups are disproportionately represented in those studies. So what we need to do then is look at studies where there is equal representation across these groups, and so the changes cannot be due to the fact that so few people were in them from the very beginning. So what can you really conclude? Okay. So I call it a tale of 3 studies. I'm going to talk about these 3 studies that I looked at, and the last one is mine. That's when our dialogue is going to happen. Okay. This was the family checkup that I said earlier. They beautifully designed this study with equal numbers of African American, Latino, and white youth, exposed them to the family checkup, integrated culture, though we're not quite sure what that is, but culture in the design, implementation, and the delivery of the program, and the theory around why they thought this would matter. They then began to offer this program, and they train each of their trainees to be culturally competent in the process of delivering this program, so that they would be mindful and they would shift based on the values that are being conveyed as they were going through the program. No evidence of family checkup having differences in what they were targeting in the program by race and ethnicity. But there was no evidence in their studies that they had actually tested what they call cultural robustness. Cultural robustness was defined in terms of how they had integrated various values, worldview, lifestyles in their study, and having program deliverers who were competent. It was never measured. It was never really tested. So we don't know what these differences really are due to, because the cultural aspect of this was not evaluated. Then from a similar group in Arizona, Jensen Bridges, with Nancy Gonzalez as part of this group, Bridges to High School, what they wanted to do was do a within group study to see whether or not culture, in this instance language, mattered in shifting those things around in the Bridges to High School program. So one group of families received the program through Spanish, the other family received the information through English. Does it matter, is what they wanted to know. Compared to the English and the Spanish speaking, language was, this should be not a significant, that's a mistype, was not a significant predictor of intervention targets. So the families responded similarly in the intervention targets, regardless of the language, culture in this instance, of the program. And so what they concluded was that universal, and the universal programs are those programs that these scholars defined as being tested primarily on white populations, universal or culturally tailored programs didn't appear to add any additive effects to what they were finding in their intervention. Okay. All right. So now let's go to these programs that came out of Georgia and Tennessee. And so what we have said is that we characterize these programs as the first programs to have been culturally tailored and designed specifically for rural African American families. And we talk about the processes by which we did this. It's very community engaged, and I'll show you the model that we use to tell you how we do what we do. So we use this model to inform the way that we do our work. So we go out into these communities, we identify stakeholders, gatekeepers, culture keepers. They become part of our research team. They help us understand whether or not the content that we're going to deliver is appropriate, its relatedness to the population. They have culturally validated our measures to see whether or not we are using language, the words that map onto how they think about describing things. We hire from the community. It's delivered in the community, churches, recreation centers, schools sometimes. They also help us identify individuals. They help us design the prescriptive theory of how we're going to implement the program in the community. They tell us Wednesday night's not a good time for any rural community. It's Bible study night. don't hold things in this particular church because they fell out with the community. So they keep us honest in terms of the ecological fit of how we're going to deliver our program. They help us identify members in the community to hire, to be part of that. They help us understand, look at our implementation procedure. So it's a very thorough process that we use of engaging them in helping us do the work that we do that then results in the programs that we develop. And it's also now informing dissemination. Where we haven't engaged them, but I know that they're doing it because SAFE is now being disseminated, they're changing. They're making decisions about what they're going to change about this program because in the real world, as the stakeholder said to us in a meeting, we're going to change it if we have to. And do you want to know what we're going to do in the changing? I have expanded this model to include a decision rule for adaptation, where we have to then go back to our community and of the adopters in this setting. If we want our programs off the shelf, we have to go and work collaboratively with the adopters and just talk with them about the setting where this is going to be done. They need to know the theory behind why you did what you did. They need to know why you have various activities included. They need to know what's central that you really, really should hold. It's like making a cake and you're deciding not to put baking powder in it or salt. Well, some things you have to have in it because that's the core of and sugar, what makes it a cake. So they need to know what those key ingredients are and then work in collaboration to determine how can you give me this feedback so that I will know what you did, because what you did may actually heighten the effect size of the outcomes that we've been targeting. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and I thought this would be my sailing into the sunset project, I wanted to, and I wrote this implementation effectiveness trial grant to really test what I feel faith-based organizations would do to our Strong African American Families program if they adopted it. Because they already told us that a lot of this icebreakers that you guys use, we're going to change them and we're going to be doing prayer. We're going to start, and if they have it now, that's probably what they're doing. So I wanted to do an implementation trial to see what happens when you train a staff at a church or churches. I had 30 churches I wanted to do this with. Train a staff, allow one, so they know about the program, they know how it works, they know the theory of change and all of this. I wanted to train half of them and then let them go. And keep notes of what you're doing. Come back and talk to us about what you're doing. Doing all of the assessments along the way. And then for the other group, we were going to hold them like we do when we're testing an efficacy trial, such that we're going to hold them to Fidelity for the first 20 families. And then after that, we were going to turn them loose. So these are people that have been indoctrinated. They should know what they're supposed to do in terms of Fidelity. We're going to turn them loose. Then the question is, for the subsequent 80 families that they bring into their church and do this, will those individuals start migrating toward making decisions about adaptation that's different than how they were taught? And what are they doing? Because we would still videotape them, but not the other group. Well, it did get funded, so I'm still working. But those are the kinds of trials that we need. And not only those kinds of trials, we also need trials, many more trials like the Deshaun team did, where you're looking at equal numbers and you're sending it out to the families, but also expand this phenotypic characteristics of culture to really measure culture, to really think about culture in the context of that. We have not in the SAFE program or the PASS program. So I want to share with you some ways that we may be able to have done that, but we didn't do it. And so we'll talk about it. But I'm going to finish my presentation. So we've demonstrated strong effects, sustaining on into young adulthood. These intervention targets matter. Families were engaged. 66% of them came to 5 or more of the sessions for the SAFE program, and I had 83% in the PASS program that went to the percentage of the ones that completed the technology program, with 75% of them going to the group setting. So they're engaged. So there's a lot about this program that people like. Okay, so then what might it be? So the benefit of cultural adaptation may not necessarily be centered around shifting the effects of the programmatic effects, but it may be important as you're thinking about these things, that the programs are valued by the community because they can see themselves. If they are engaged in the materials and the activities and it elevates attendance adherence, then it may foster successful development that you can then see in your evaluation of the program. Participation may increase, as I said earlier about the SAFE program, and acceptance and overall satisfaction, because these families do report that they like the program, they enjoy the program. So retention and attrition rates may be positively influenced in that lower attrition, increased retention may be influenced by having these culturally adapted programs. But there's a need to begin to think about the balance, because the time, the money, the energy that we spend to develop them, and we are not saying that you can come in and make whatever cake you like. We like chocolate cake, and you can make whatever you want. So give active voice in the design is the first thing that we can do in this process. But the potential conflicts of the community, we need to think about how they are scientifically inconsistent with how the community thinks about the work that they want to do if they're going to take up our program. We prefer, as researchers, randomized controlled trials. Communities may say, we want everybody to come. We don't want some people left out. We're highly objectionable to your leaving out our Sunday school teacher and her family because they're center to this community. We have to it means a dialogue. You have to sit and talk about these things, especially in communities when there are fewer resources to offer the program exactly the way that it was designed to be offered. It's important for them to know what is central, what is key. If I had to choose between the 6 sessions, which ones appear to be really on point? And I'll say this, and then I'm almost finished. So what I'm doing in a project now with a colleague at University of California, Irvine, we have the PASS program being delivered to risk-engaging youth in LA and whomever she can find in Orange County that's African American. And we're merging neuroscience and prevention science, where she's a neuropsychiatrist, and I do prevention. She's doing fMRIs on these kids, and she's looking at, so they're exposed to triggers that map onto the intervention targets at baseline. They're exposed to the program. She comes back and she does a follow-up fMRI. What we're able to tell from the data we have already, certain sessions light up the brain, the amygdala of the kids and others don't. And that there appears to be profiles of kids that are much more responsive to certain sessions. We can now begin to develop these profiles and do precision intervention so that we think everybody has to come to all the sessions. That's what we work hard for, because dosage matters. What we're beginning to show is it may be much more important to give people what they need in a program to shift them. The other stuff is just wasting their time and your time. So is it that attendance falls off because what we're giving people is not lighting up their brains? So for people with few resources, having to then make decisions, and they have a group of high-risk kids, and we have the profiles of those kids that are much more responsive to sessions 2, 5, and 6, we can tell that adopter, your population looks like this. What we have found is that those kids de-escalate the use of alcohol and substance and have engaged in fewer risky sexual practices after being exposed to session 2, 5, and 6. So the way that we're moving into behavioral medicine, this is suggests that we can begin to think about, medicine, we can begin to think about precision in behavioral medicine as well. But anyway, I got a little bit sidetracked. So, are culturally tailored programs more effective than the original evidence-based program? We know little about it because there have been few theories to help inform us. There have been few studies that have been designed to test it. We need concept clarity when we talk about what do we mean, tailoring, adapting based on culture. What aspects of culture do we need to target? How? And what component of the intervention? Is it the process? Is it the content? Is it the hiring? Is it the prescriptive theory, theoretical structure of it? We need more research, as we always say at the end of our papers, but what such tailoring entails is how to achieve it and how it impacts the outcome has not been empirically examined. We don't know it. And I just couldn't believe at the end of my story that we don't know it, but we don't know it. And so what can we conclude then? All the things I just said. Standardized cultural adaptation guidelines are needed because people are doing all kinds of things that they're calling cultural adaptation. Documenting it throughout, just as we measure all other aspects of the intervention, how are we also measuring culture throughout the integration of our programs so that people can then begin to replicate? That's why we have lots of recipes of how to do this, because there are no true guidelines. There's a need to examine in depth what these programs are really doing in randomized trials, because the assumption of heterogeneity and grouping people, that is the heterogeneity, that you have these 3 groups of people by race and ethnicity, that is not it. And the Deshawn study and the Jensen study showed us, and it showed us they couldn't tease it out. Well, maybe it's because they really didn't measure culture. So I say the jury is still out, but the challenges provide opportunities. And I'm going to stop and we can talk for 30 minutes. Questions, comments? How many of you are surprised by what I just shared with you? Me? Hey, me too. I'm telling you, and it's so interesting because I wrote a commentary to these papers that I mentioned to you earlier, Jensen and Deshawn and some other people. I can't remember who else. And I came up with the fact, and I said this then, but I'm saying it in a different framework due to Pamela asking me if I could talk about this. And then I said, well, let me just pull up the leaves a bit and really see across the board. And I looked at lots of programs, Keeping It Real, and lots of them. And we all talk about it. Then I began to say, okay, now that you're pointing at them, as this elderly gentleman told me many years ago when I was a 20-year-old, look at how many fingers are pointing back at you and you're pointing that way. And I said, okay, then let me look at my program. And while we tout it as being that, we don't really measure it. What makes it, in our mind culturally, is that the community helped us develop it, but we didn't, So, yeah, Dale.
I look at adaptation kind of like Woody Hayes looked at throwing a forward pass. How many of you know who Woody Hayes was? Okay. A very famous football player. Because there are only 3 things that can happen, and 2 of them are bad.
Yeah.
Because what you're going to get is either you're going to improve
Yeah.
the performance of that program, or it's not going to have any effect, or it
Or it's
might
going to be
actually
harmful.
reduce
Yeah,
the effect.
and harmful effects. Yeah.
And the issue then is when we make adaptations, we create a new requirement for an evaluation to
Yeah.
determine whether that evaluation, what effect that evaluation has.
Exactly.
The cost associated with the adaptations that we're talking about is huge.
Yeah.
Now, the issue is we don't know enough, as I think you said.
Yeah.
We don't know enough about how much of an adaptation really changes the program.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a critical issue.
Yeah.
And that issue says to me that you have to have the dialogue, as you suggested,
Yes.
between the developer and those who are implementing the program.
Right.
Because if you can get them to talk,
Yes.
then the adaptation is going to be consistent with the logic model.
Yes.
One of the first things that bothered me when I talk to people about adaptation is they don't know what the logic model is,
Right.
and they propose an adaptation which is inconsistent
Yes.
with that logic.
Yes. Yes.
It's-
Yes.
And the other problem is that the real danger for adaptation is not that kind of negotiation and
Yeah.
adaptation. It's when frontline people
Yeah.
decide on their own
Yes.
to change something. So instead of having a lesson on sexuality in LST, you insert a program you like, which is a kind of DARE program of
Yeah.
what the negative consequences are,
Yeah.
for that behavior,
Yeah.
things which we know don't work.
Yes. Yes.
There's where the real danger for
That
adaptation.
that is so true. And so I love what you're saying, Del. And the other thing is working out a system where you can actually introduce ways to assess what they're doing and then talk about it. Yeah, but many program adopters, community adopters, haven't seen the research, and they have not seen the logic model, and they do not know the theory of change. And so when you don't know that, and you go online and Amazon is selling your program and they get it, then whatever happens, happens. But so one of the things that was said in this meeting that I attended at the National Academy of Medicine that talked about these issues, and it was, when someone wants to adopt your program, you have to establish a relationship with them and work it out. But that means a dialogue rather than saying no, because you may have a chance to really escalate what the effects of the program, because they may be doing something different in the process of delivering this. Like allowing, rather than having our icebreakers for safe, so what if you use a scripture to anchor future orientation rather than having people go around and see how many states you've lived in and for the rest of your life? So it could be that, but the only way we would know that as the program adopter, potential adopter said to us at this meeting, don't you want to know if I only offered 4 of your sessions and I did this to it, but they were your sessions, I just did this. Wouldn't you want to know if my kids are doing well? Wouldn't you want to know that? And many of the program developers said, you have to deliver it the way that it was tested in order to achieve the outcomes. So they stay on your shelf. Any other questions? But yes. Where's your hard question? I'm waiting. I'm waiting.
I'm sitting here thinking about how to address this.
Uh-oh. Do I need some help? Pamela?
I'm trying to separate changes in programs that are aspects other than the theoretical issues in the program.
Yeah.
Versus changing the theory. So there are lots of changes that can be made around a program. I don't do this, but I'm saying there are lots of changes that can be made around a program as long as you sustain the theoretical issue. I've talked about this as the anthropologist error. Anthropologists say different cultures are very different. But you can go in at the theoretical level and show invariance across very different societies. So a lot of our work in the slums of Nairobi, in Beijing, China, show exactly the same things, the same protective factors. Those protective factors, as long as they have the protective effect, doesn't matter if it's in China provided by a grandfather and in Nairobi provided by a peer, the effect of protection is the same. It's invariant. So I think the discourse that you've been going through is important. But it's important to separate whether the changes are in the theory or whether the changes are in aspects of acceptance of a program and things like that.
And because we don't develop this relationship with the people that are adopting our programs the way that it allows us to know that, we don't know a lot about that. So one of the things that's happening with the SAFE program is Brody is looking at the delivery of this program through cooperative extension, which is this a land grant institution here? This place is not. This place is okay. So the cooperative extension. How many of you know what How many of you know what 4-H is? You've heard of 4-H. That's cooperative extension. So he's going through 4-H, if you will, and he's looking at the 4-H agents' delivery of SAFE. And they're sending back information, but the information that they're sending back is primarily around the intervention targets to see whether or not the intervention targets are sustained with delivered in real world setting. But I'm not sure how much of that information he's getting about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and how much of that they're doing. In other words, what adaptations are really happening out there. And I don't know that that's being examined, because it could be. But you're right. It's so if people, and that's one of the messages that came out of this report at the National Academy of Medicine. They said people need to know the theories. Why did you connect these things? Why are they important from a theoretical perspective? And if they know that, then the process by which they achieve what they achieve, as long as they know what is causing and what is preventing. But for many of us, this is really our child. And you're coming in to say you're going to just completely do plastic surgery on it, so I don't recognize it anymore. And that's where we have to be comfortable with the confidence that we have in the sustainability of our program, that it allows itself to be flexible enough. And then you tell me how you have changed this child so that I can say, oh, yeah, that is the same kid. They just look prettier now. Other questions or comments? I think I have until 2:30, so I'm here.
I don't know, what's our time?
Yeah,
The talk
it's
itself?
early.
To 2.
Talk goes to 2. Or does it go to 2:30?
Well, I got finished early. Everything is ended at 2:30, right? Yeah, it's from 1 to 2:30.
What do y'all remember? 2:30.
You see that? They're still seated. Yeah.
Well, we'll let you wrap it when you're comfortable.
Question over here.
I am just being directed. Yeah.
This is so fascinating. I absolutely love it. I was so on the edge of my seat waiting for you to tell me the outcomes of your study, which wasn't funded. I'm curious, what do you think? What do you think they would have been? Just your
The faith-based?
church.
The faith-based?
Yeah, the church one.
Well, first, let me tell you what the criticism was. The criticism was, so the study was going to be done in Tennessee. So Tennessee is a Bible belt. We had the 5 denominations of black churches. It's what we had. They were concerned that we only had these 5 denominations. Well, there weren't Episcopals in these rural communities, and this is what we got: Baptist, Methodist. So, and we showed them from this Tennessee records. So that was one criticism. So I'm still really bothered. You can tell that it didn't get funded. But what I think, and I don't know this. It's an empirical question. That's what I should first preface it by saying.
Of course it is, but I want to know what you think.
What I think is that the group that we randomly assigned to, everybody came in for training, was the design. Everybody knew about Fidelity and how important it is. But the group that I turned away, I mean, you can do what you just keep records and send us your diaries, and we'll look at it and we'll meet with you and we'll talk about what you're doing. I think we would have seen the content shifted such that there would be, because it was going to be held in churches and it was their health ministry of these churches that were going to be delivering this program. And I think that they would have infused a lot of scripture and parables in the way that they talked about it. I think a lot of the activities would shift such that it was much more spiritually, religiously laden. And I believe, because it maps onto the culture of the worldview of the way that these people live their lives, because their lives are really centered around the church. The church is the hub of a lot of activities. I think first because it's held in the church, both groups probably would look a lot different with stronger effects than we saw in our SAFE program. And so I think that's what I think about that group. For the other group that we held our research arms around, and this is how you have to do it. No, you shouldn't have shifted that. You know how we do with the videotapes and reporting back. So I think, of course, for the first 20 families, because they know that we're watching you, they would do it as we wanted them to do it. And maybe the second 20, but by the third 20, because they had 100 families that they were going to run this program through. By the third, I would see some shifting in how they did what they did. I would not expect them to go all the way to where the whole content and the whole processes were changed, but I expect a balance between what the curriculum, the fidelity that should be adhered to, But these people, I expected the renegades, if you will, to just, it may be a plastic surgery. I may not even recognize it by the time I get it back. But the bottom line for me is how much of the core elements of this program. I mean, there's some things that are central in terms of the principles that we have about how we think things should happen, or, well, the way that things, if these things happen the way that we say, because good parenting is great, having a great communication with your child is great, kids knowing what your norms and expectations are, kids having resistance skills, kids knowing how to pick out kids who are more likely to hang out and skip school and do all those things and stay away from them. So there's some core things that are protective, as Richard mentioned earlier, Dick mentioned earlier. So if those things, if we can see in their diaries, which is what I want to see, how did you talk about these things? To me, then, it allows me to begin to say, guess what? We have a faith-based, adapted version of this program, and this is what it looks like, and they are rocking in terms of what they're doing in this community, and everybody is coming because they love it. It's part of the church. It's like Sunday school or however they deliver it. And we now have a church-based version of this. But to let them know what the theory, what is the theory behind this, and what did our other original evidence base show. And my hope is that it's better. You know, as our parents would want they be better. So for the next iteration of this, be better. And maybe it's because I think kids should grow up and get out of the nest. And so I'm less, you know, there's some of my colleagues at this meeting in DC, you know, we had a little bit of a tussle going there because some of the developers were saying, absolutely not. And then this community person whispered to me and says, I know that because I contacted this person and they told me, no way. Even though our school was getting ready to wanted this program, but they said, this is how we have to change it because da-da-da-da-da. We're not changing everything. We're changing some of the way that you do what you do. No way, Jose. And so they walked away from thousands of dollars because it has to be whole hog. It has to be everything. Yeah.
So I really like your message to developers.
Yeah.
And if you can bear with me for a minute. I think of our work as being a very young field in prevention science. And I think about this analogy where our programs are like cars. And we have a few cars that work. We don't have an infrastructure. We don't have licensing. We don't have training. We don't know how do you modify it and it'll still work.
Yeah.
Cars have been around for about 130 years. The first cars that were built, I don't think you could probably adjust the seats or the mirrors.
It's a great analogy.
You got what you got.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
most people could get in it and
Yeah.
drive from point A to point B, and
Yeah.
they got them there.
Yeah.
Some of them comfortably and some of them uncomfortably. And I think that's kind of where we're at in
Yeah.
prevention now.
Yeah.
We've developed a few programs that work.
Yeah.
And we think that'll get you from point A to point B for most people. Some of them comfortably and some of them uncomfortably. But we need to start designing our programs, like you're saying, where there are things that when you get in it, you can adjust it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can adjust the seats, I can adjust the mirrors, but I'm not gonna mess around with
With
the
the engine.
ignition system.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, yeah.
So you really have to know, well, what are the parts of the car that
Yeah.
I can comfortably adapt?
Yeah.
But don't expect the consumer to know the difference between what's adaptable and what's not.
Right.
We have to build our programs.
I like it.
So
Yeah.
that there's a concept in psychology called affordances.
Yeah.
Where
Right.
we build affordances into programs that permit that encourage adaptation
Yeah.
without changing the integrity of the program.
Yes,
So,
yes, I love it. I love it. And so we have these wonderful sea of young scholars out here. And so maybe before I ride out in the sunset, we'll have these guidelines that any person that's getting ready to do, it's just like physicians have guidelines of what you say to parents when you're going to give them medication. We need to think about our medicine, which are these programs, for guidelines. Guidelines to tell people, don't open up the hood and put this in the engine, because this is not going to work. These are the things that are adaptable, and they can be adapted. So have at it.
Yeah.
Do whatever you want to. Put new lights in. But, we have to, but there are no guidelines. And the guidelines aren't there because we don't have, first, the theory about how you do it and the empirical evidence to demonstrate that when these things are shifted, that these are the things that still won't matter. So we need, for those model programs, in my view, we need to begin to test them in real life situation as implementation effectiveness trials. If we can get the federal government to give us money to do it.
So in those kinds of trials,
Yeah.
would you be following the same criteria? That is, you'd be randomizing within study to program as best as possible.
Yeah.
A program that's been culturally adapted, as opposed to saying, I'm just going to do this culturally adapted program and compare it to someone else in another study that didn't adapt.
I don't have those answers. The way that I was designing mine was everybody got trained in a standard way, and they knew about the program. And then one group really did deliver it like a real life situation, and you just track it. And then the question is, what did you do and why did you do it? And then what you did and why you did it end up with your kids looking worse or better?
That's a good design.
So that's what I used. That was the design. I wish you had been on the panel, study section. So, but that was the design, because to me, one is you still have some semblance of control that we do in these regular research overseeing projects. But I then would turn them loose after a while. So do you still keep doing what it is that I've been holding you to the money on, or do you stray? And then that also tells you a little bit about just the natural order of how things will happen when it's real versus when researchers are monitoring, overseeing, helicoptering. Yes, and then you.
Are you aware of any studies for implementation design programs where the designers worked with the communities that they were hoping to impact from the beginning to co-create the program?
We did that with SAFE.
Okay.
It was co-created by not the people that actually got the program, but our community stakeholders who lived in the community, but they were not part of the study. So they were there. They told us what looks crazy, and we would never do that. So they were there helping us design the program.
Did you study the ease of implementation or uptake and compare that to anything else?
No, the only thing that I know is that the folks at Georgia have a dissemination specialist, and that person is marketing the program. I think they've been to some Blueprint conferences, and that right now some school districts and Cooperative Extension, and I'm not sure who else, but they're different than the population that we tested it on, because the population we tested it on were rural families. So for me, the uptake, I would be looking for organizations in these rural communities, now that they know this program is available, that those would be the communities that I'd be interested in, reasons why they have not, that program is not infused in these communities where we actually tested it. So it's not that it's even in urban, it's in urban settings, not rural. Except cooperative extension. Yeah. Beverly. Oh, no. You're not next. She's next.
I really appreciated what you had to say about cultural adaptation not always being necessarily race and ethnicity.
It isn't.
So, yeah, and so I'm curious, if you have any thoughts on like how we might be able to think about or determine to what is that culture that we should be adapting to, like whether it's race and ethnicity or SES or rural, urban, what is that cultural piece we should be attending to, like at the start? Just any.
Well, what I'll have to draw on is what the operational definition of culture. What people think about when they say culture. It's people's way of living. It's your norms. It's the values. It's the meaning you make of life. It's your worldview. It's your language. It's your rituals. It's what governs how you do what you do. It's your spirituality. And so with it being that fluid, then I have to back up and say, well, what is it about culture that needs to be incorporated in programs in order to change behavior? So maybe it's values and norms. Maybe it is spirituality. So it's to talk with that population if we're going to do it. And it's not just the population, but I think more in terms of groups of people who share common norms and values. That's the group. And because a lot of people that look like me most people that look like me don't think like me. So I can't say that I'm designing a program for African Americans without really thinking about who that is. And so for the rural families that we develop SAFE for, there's something about the rural context that needed to be in that program. The church, as one of the elders said to us when we were developing the program, you need to find a way to talk about religion and church and faith in the way that you do what you do. So we knew that was important. We also knew that support, drawing on other people in your community for support. So there are things that we just knew from talking to them that somehow the curriculum needs to reflect that. And that's why I said if I step back and really look at the SAFE program, we probably have some evidence of culture in it. We just haven't pulled it out to look at, was this the part of it that mattered in moving these things around? Yeah, but that's for these young scholars. It's for you to tell us. So now one charge is guidelines to help people know that they can move the mirrors, but not change the oil and the engine and all that. And we need someone to help us think about what are central components of culture, the way that we think about culture, that are important if we're trying to change behavior in preventive interventions. And that is beyond my pay grade. I don't know that. And Beverly.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go back to when we were talking about the co-creation of your program with the community. And did you document the processes that you used to do that?
We documented it to the extent that the rough drafts of the curriculum that Virginia Mulgard, do you guys know Virginia? She works with Expo. Nobody knows Virginia? Okay, she is like the goddess of family-based programs, curriculum writer. So we have those sessions where where those adaptations that our community made to the original curriculum, and they kept iterations of that. We do have that.
But even, I'm thinking about more the overarching process of like the stages of what you did. Like you just showed that conceptual model, a little bit of that.
That came from that model.
Okay. Have you published on that model?
I've inserted this model in some things that I've published. Let me put it that way. But not
Yeah.
we've described it in several publications.
Because I think that could be, I mean, at least in the work that I do,
Yeah.
extremely valuable,
Yeah.
and to be able to articulate that.
And so if you look at this
Yeah.
model, this is what we do when we go out into the communities. When we developed SAFE, we first told them, this is what you have shared with us for having conducted research on rural African American families for 15 years, and let us share this with you in terms, way that they would understand. Not all of our research is this model and that model. And then we said, tell us what you think about that. Then they would talk to us about it. That's when this one gentleman in the audience, very quiet church deacon in the audience, he said, when we first started talking about what we had found from our studies, he said, I don't see anything in your whole boxes up there with arrows that has anything going to the church. And Jean and I looked at each other and said, well, we don't study religion and religiosity in our work. And he said, then go back to that university and find out where it belongs. And when you come back, then we'll tell you whether or not we're going to let you be in our community, because the church is important. One of the important protective process for these families. So they help us then begin to think about this, and they also help us think about how to do what we were going to do. And they would say, 12 weeks, are you serious? But we aren't doing that. We aren't going to do that. And so, okay, so they, yeah, so.
Okay. And how long did that process take?
Oh, Lordy.
I was afraid of.
Well, to do the curriculum, probably 6 months. And these meetings, we would have these standing meetings in the community. And so this would, and they wanted to see. So not only do they tell you what you need to have, they expect us to come back and show them what we've actually done. So it's not just say, yeah, you can speak to us, but it's just a courtesy call. Not in those communities. So then that process, it took us about a year to get everything ready in terms of the curriculum. And then we pilot tested on families that we got other feedback from them. And then we were ready to roll. And I think because of the time we take, which if you're writing grants and you're working with populations that require really developing a relationship with them, because I don't view them as our participants, we have a relationship with these families. Many of them are still with us since 1995 for one of our studies. And in the grant, it just has to be clearly articulated what that timeline is and why. Did you have a question earlier? Oh, no. Quiet. Thoughtful. Silent moments of thoughtfulness. So, Pamela, thank you so much for asking me to do this. And quite frankly, I'm trying to decide if I want to write this up. Because we'll do it together. I would love to. It is just not what I had all expected to say to you today, because my passion is that we have to design programs, and maybe we do, because that's what draws them. If people don't see themselves in what they are exposed to, they are more likely not to relate to it. And I'll leave with this one story to further refine that. When I was at the University of Georgia, we were working in a middle school, and the principal of the middle school wanted us to bring this program into her school because of the increased pregnancy patterns of middle schoolers in her school. And she said, and what made me really know, one, that I need a program like this, and two, that even the smartest kids who know all about this stuff can get pregnant, that it was time to do this. And the student, the top student in the class that was pregnant, said to her, but none of the figures in the books nor anything they've used look like me, so I thought this was a program for white girls. So if nothing else, maybe it says, as this said earlier, engagement may be higher. People, so you may be able to get exposure, even if it doesn't matter in terms of the outcomes. What is it that is about this that increases the sense of relatability and satisfaction and ownership that may then get this work out such that people begin to adopt it? Yeah. And I think I'm finished.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, this is fun.